night for those who are listening and hearing from us from other part of the world. My name is Hugo Stornayolo. I am the Latin America correspondent for Navarra Confidencial, and today we're going to do a webinar with Kai Weiss, who is an Austrian thinker and who is the editor of a recently published book called The Green Market Revolution: How Can Market Environmentalism Can Protect Nature and Save the World? All right, Kai, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, hi, thanks for the invitation. So I work at the Austrian Economics Center, as well as the Hayek Institute, which are both based in Vienna, Austria. And we usually tend to work on, economic issues, on typical libertarian topics, spreading free market ideas throughout Europe and the world. But as you may remember, just a few months ago, at the beginning of the year, the big and overarching topic was environmentalism. Also last year, you've had hundreds of thousands of people on the street protesting for Fridays for Future. You had Greta Thunberg, this 16-year-old girl, basically being given a platform that I don't think a 16-year-old has had in quite some time. Everyone was really, really panicky about sorry, I was just confused about that, but I guess that's the Spanish subtitle, so that's fine. Everyone was panicky at the beginning of the year about the Australian wildfires. Everyone was like, oh, will be the biggest issue of the year. Now, a lot has changed ever since, obviously, because of the coronavirus, also because of so many other topics and crises we're currently going through. But for us, it was just really, really important to actually look into these issues, because for me personally, I'm someone who loves to spend time in the mountains. I live about 1.5 to 2 hours from the Alps, so I'm hiking there a lot, doing a lot of trips to different beautiful landscapes, and I want to see those preserved. And I think everyone who's spending time there wants to see nature protected. And considering this topic has become so big, and I think it will become bigger and bigger again after the coronavirus kind of has hopefully subsided soon, I think it's very, very important to look into these issues. And for us, there was this problem that a lot of free marketeers, a lot of conservative, classical liberal voices simply ignored the issue for a long, long time, just basically engaged in Greta Thunberg bashing and I'm not a scientist, but climate change denial and all that kind of stuff. And for us, it was important to look at these issues seriously, to take them at face value, and to provide pro-market solutions to them. And that's where the book came in that we published last week, namely to show how you can be both pro-environment, pro-ecology, as well as pro-markets and pro-capitalism. And that's sort of the project, what it's all about.
Yes, well, for the last few months, there's been a revival of the environmentalist movement promoted by this Greta Thunberg girl, and by the socialist wing of the Democratic Party in the US. They are promoting more environmental taxes and so on. And this has been the leaning of most of the politicians, both in Europe and in the US. In Latin America, we cannot talk too much about that because it's not that much of an issue, except when it comes to oil. But there hasn't been much of a voice about environmentalism in conservative and libertarian groups. I think the only example we have nowadays is Naomi Zeit, this girl who was hired by the Harland Institute to be the nemesis
She's from Germany, right?
Yeah, she's from Germany. To be the nemesis of Greta. So to see a different approach on environmental issues is very much a surprise to most of us, because in a sense, most of libertarian and conservatives are very close to nature, but not on a political level. So what can you tell us about this?
I mean, I think that's a great point that you're making. It's a very, very conservative issue, for instance. I mean, if you look at protecting nature, it's literally in the word. If we're talking about conserving nature, conserving, conservative, that's something, I mean, that's really in the conservative sort of agenda. It should be really a central part of it, to protect our planet, to protect our heritage in that sense. And yeah, I think it's just such a major issue. Now, I don't really know why. I'm kind of pulling in both conservatives and classical liberals here at the same time. I don't know if people don't like that, but that's how I feel like, at least when it comes to environmentalism, both conservatives and classical liberals have been, well, not very active and not very enthusiastic. And I'm not sure why. I mean, the left has been owning this issue for pretty much the last few decades. The other side of the political spectrum hasn't really cared about it at all. And that has obviously made it even easier for the left to own the issue and to make it seem like if you are for the environment, you have to be a socialist. And I mean, I can speak of that from personal experience. I haven't been a pro-market guy all my life, actually, only for like 4 or 5 years now. And before that, I was a socialist. And how did I get into that? Because back in high school, in I think a geology class, our teacher showed us An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. And I remember, it's obviously a very panicky movie. I think it goes way beyond what is actually a realistic estimation of what might happen on climate change. But I went back home and I was actually scared, and I was telling my parents, please let us watch this movie so that you realize what major crises we will be faced with. And simply there wasn't really the responses, how to solve climate change and how to protect our beautiful landscapes, have always been more government, more government, more government. And the right side of the spectrum hasn't really done anything against it, other than, I mean, I know Naomi side a little bit, kind of just, you know, bashing and not really taking the issue seriously. And I think, like, as someone who has cared about the environment and who was a socialist because of the environment, I can understand why young people care about the topic, why they do want this issue to be massively discussed. And because of that, I think it's very, very important that we actually have responses to that we actually show how our ideas of individual liberty, rule of law, local communities, and so forth, how those can also work in the environmental realm. Because if we actually have responses, we might actually have a chance to both protect our nature, and not by implementing something like Green New Deals or something like that to destroy the economy at the same time, but to actually see both the environment and the economy see a boost. And I think showing how this is not a zero-sum game, but how both can actually be helped for in the same way, I think is incredibly important.
Well, from what you're saying, I think we have a kind of a dichotomy. We have two sides. On the left side, we have identity politics about the indigenous peoples and the environment, veganism, and environmental taxes mostly, which is what is being promoted by most governments and which is being indoctrinated in most of schools. On the other side, we have most of the right-wingers who talk about local solutions, about this thing of in each community there has to be a solution for its own environmental problems. I think that the Vox in Spain is promoting this kind of thinking about environment. And a few years ago in France, there was a group called Famille Chasse that promoted a similar view. So why do you think most of the left-wing establishment is trying to promote more heavy taxes on environmental issues? I'm not talking about environmental regulation by itself, but environmental taxes.
I mean, because the tendency of the left is always to tax everything that they can tax. And obviously, if you have an issue at hand and you are on the left of the political spectrum, you may have a tendency to want to tax it. And I mean, there are a lot of issues with the environmental strategy on the left. I think, as you mentioned, there's also a bit of identity politics, actually. I was quite surprised if you look at what activists actually demand. It often has nothing to do with the environment, even though they are environmental activists. So if you look at, there's a lot of stuff on so-called climate justice, which is something that groups like Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion are sort of proposing. And it has very little to do with environmentalism. It has to do with, protecting indigenous people, not have any cultural misappropriation, to have LGBTQ issues being discussed, and all those kinds of things that have nothing to do with the environment. And so there's a lot of weird stuff going on there. And then you go into the actual policy options like Green New Deal, and again, you can see how it often, again, has nothing to do with the environment, how it often has to do with basically just introducing socialist policies. And yeah, I don't know why that is. I feel just that there's obviously a natural tendency on the left to propose these kinds of things, to propose to regulate, to tax, to have more centralized policy making. But yeah, I mean, that just makes it even more important to have a response to that and not just sit there and bash them endlessly, because I don't think that helps really.
Well, and as you can see, this has its basis on, well, the UN and most of its environmental programs and the regulations they are proposing. For example, you have these green pacts, you have these green agreements the United Nations are promoting every few years, and so on. You have the Millennium principles and all of this stuff, and they are just trying to make policy out of it. Do you think this is part of a larger global tendency towards a left-leaning environmental thinking about taxes and about markets? Because most of the time it has to do with more and more regulations on the market. Well, the market itself has proposed some of the best solutions for environmental issues. For example, Tesla and the electric automobile industry.
Well, I'm not sure if I would put Tesla in there, because as far as I know, they are heavily subsidized. But other than that, it's obviously true that the market is much, much better at protecting the planet than government could ever be. I mean, government is generally a terrible steward of the environment. In one of the chapters of the book, I'm looking at what, for instance, the EU is doing, which is already the European Union, which is already really, really bad. I mean, if you look, they are subsidizing fossil fuels. They are their agricultural subsidies are leading to greater nitrate pollution in waters. Their fisheries policy has led to an 80% depletion of fish stocks in Europe. There's just a lot of stuff going on that. I think the greatest and most shocking example is that the same politicians that constantly talk about, oh, we are so green and we want to be more environmentally friendly and blah, blah, blah. At the same time, globally, $10 million per minute are being spent on fossil fuel subsidies worldwide. And that's not just, you know, oil countries or something like that. That's really Western countries as well. Those are the UK, EU countries, the US, and so forth. They are subsidizing fossil fuels by $10 million a minute. And if you would get rid of that completely tomorrow, you would be able to decrease CO2 emissions by 1/4. And that just shows you how absolutely horrible governments are, because they could easily do that, but they don't. And at the same time, the market is so much more efficient. And we may be able to get into why that is the case. But if you look simply at the statistics, there's a environmental performance index by Yale and I think Columbia University, which kind of looks at how well green and clean countries are in the world. And if you kind of compare that with the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, you will see that free countries are much, much cleaner and greener than socialist, despotic countries are. And you can look at countries like the US, countries like Europe, countries in Europe, where you have seen CO2 reductions over the last few years or even some decades, whereas countries like China are basically are still very, very dirty economies, and I hope it changes soon. But if you look at statistics, if you look at the history, if you look at the Soviet Union, for instance, when we look at history, then you can see socialism doesn't help the environment at all. The market actually helps the environment. And that's a clear, if you just look at the statistics, it's a very, very clear answer.
Well, a while ago in my country, in Ecuador, we had a wave of protest back in October of 19, in which a large group of indigenous communities and indigenous movements, they promoted fossil fuels subsidized. They wanted to maintain this because for them it's part of a huge business. Most of them are into it. And there was this particular paradox of most of the left-wing groups agreeing on maintaining the full subsidies, and the right-wing groups agreeing on eliminating them. And so I think this is an image of what you're talking about. On the other hand, we're talking about the fisheries problem. I was reading a paper on this economic and legal problem called the tragedy of the commons and the tragedy of the anti-commons, in which most of the time when a good is made public, there is not much responsibility on how to manage it. Do you think the environment falls into that category?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the main points when it comes to market environmentalism. Like the basis of the market economy is our private property rights. And if you have private property rights, you are actually very likely to not have tragedy of the commons. So when you have, for instance, just take some piece of land that is not owned by anyone, but you have, I don't know, 10 farmers using that land, then there's no incentive for those farmers to actually take care of the land because they don't own it. So basically, they will very likely overgraze the grass, the land, simply because there's no incentive for them to actually use it sustainably. Whereas if you, say, split up the land into 10 parts and each farmer has his own property, then that farmer will be incentivized to actually take care of that property. And so usually when we look at environmental issues, it's often about not having defined property rights well enough. It's often about that, and I think governments, one might say, they do have a place in protecting the environment, namely by actually safeguarding, protecting, defining property rights. And I think that would go a long way, because as Aristotle already said 2,500 years ago or so, that which no one owns, nobody will care for. And obviously the counter, the vice versa, that which someone owns, someone will take care of. And I think that also opens up a lot of options for environmentalists to actually be active. So, I mean, it's one thing to protest on Fridays, but I think it's another thing to basically do what land trusts are doing. There are thousands of land trusts in this world that do nothing other. They are nonprofits, philanthropic. They do nothing else but buying land that they want to see protected. One great example of that is the American Prairie Reserve in Montana. They are currently buying up land in eastern Montana that is, if they have, when they have purchased all the land, it will be bigger than Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks combined. That's really massive, just as a warning. And they basically want to simply recreate a kind of American Serengeti, if you want. So they want to have people, when they go there, that people will see the land in the same way again as Lewis and Clark did 220 or so years ago, when they first crossed the West, the American West. And there's so many examples of that, of simply organizations that do well. They use their money and they buy the land because they can own it. They can own the land because there are private property rights. And I think that just opens up so many possibilities for environmental protection based on private property, not on tragedy of the commons. Now, what I would also like to say, I think when it comes to tragedy of the commons, there's a bit of a weird way of always looking at it as if there are only two options. One is you nationalize it, you nationalize the property in the sense of, okay, so this is not owned by anyone. Now we need to, and it's fully overexploited because there are no incentives to take care of it. So that means government needs to come in and basically regulate it to death. The other part is what I just proposed, which is you privatize it and give the property to someone who then has the incentive to take care of it. And that, I think that works in many, many different cases, but it doesn't work in all cases, and it doesn't even have to work in all cases. Because if you look at the work that Elinor Ostrom has done, she's a Nobel Prize winner of economics, I think in 2009, I believe. She, for instance, showed, and she saw that in thousands of different cases in the world, how actually oftentimes, and you already mentioned it, Ugo, when it comes to that tragedy of the commons can also be prevented through local solutions, through communities coming together. So one prominent example, if we take again the piece of land example that nobody owns. Well, Elinor Ostrom went to Switzerland, and she was quite surprised to see that lands weren't really owned by anyone, but they still weren't overexploited. Why? Because local communities actually came together and developed mechanisms how to actually use the land collectively as a community. And sort of these mechanisms developed throughout time, traditions developed, because local communities had the opportunity to, I mean, they are obviously the ones closest to the environmental issue, to the tragedy, and they have the greatest knowledge, and they can solve the issue. It doesn't have to be the central government hundreds of miles ago in a capital city. You can also have it on the ground, people voluntarily coming together and finding solutions. And I don't know, that was a really, really complicated response to what you were actually asking, but I hope it was still helpful.
Well, I think the Montana example is one of the best examples of how localism can help the environment without the regulation and taxation commotion it will cause. Central government decides to take the matter in its hands. Well, in South America, we have some of these examples, one of which it was promoted by the government itself as a way of making other people pay for the protection of a specific area. In Ecuador, we have this area called the Yasuní National Park. I think it's quite known to the outside world of my country. And during the socialist president Rafael Correa, they tried to make the Yasuní National Park a protected area in which there wouldn't be any kind of oil industry. And so the proposal of him and his government and most of the groups that were supporting him was to, in a sense, make celebrities and make people to donate money in order to compensate for the oil sales that they were losing by not making an exploitation of the Yasuní National Park. It failed horribly because they didn't manage to get even 50% of the money they were trying to get. And so I think that's the example of how governments fail in order to protect the environment. On the other hand, you have the example of a private individual, Princess Anne of the United Kingdom, that she has some land here in Ecuador in order to produce tea. And she has 2 or 3 enterprises that produce the tea that they sell. They are owned by Princess Anne of the UK. And those areas are some of the best preserved in my country. So in real life examples in the modern day, you have plenty of those. In Europe, how does this work? Do you have any examples of bad state regulations and good private initiatives to protect the environment?
Yeah, I mean, so I've already mentioned a few, like the EU doing all of their horrible things. There's actually a good example. Again, with fossil fuels, the European Union now, after Corona, they want to introduce a so-called recovery fund through which they kind of want to kickstart the economy again. It's horrible throughout, but I think what was actually funny or frustrating, depending on how you look at it, was when they basically said that everything from the recovery fund needs to be green. It needs to add to the green transition of Europe. But the money can still be used for fossil fuels. So that's beautiful. And I think that's a great example how political environmentalism, if the government is doing it, it's always subject to special interests. It's always subject to lobbying. And for powerful players in the political realm basically getting an exception or something like that. And whereas you don't get any special favors on the market. Now, already mentioned Switzerland when it comes to a positive example in Europe of where government, where private individuals have come together and decided to do something and have actually protected the environment through that. There are so many examples. You have, I think every day you could probably come up with some entrepreneur who has a new idea of how he or she wants to protect the environment through some new innovation, through some new idea. One example I think we mentioned in the book is in the UK, again, a localism example, where you have local communities coming together and deciding that they want to help producers of renewable energies in their region by buying their products and then using them in the community to generate the energy. But they use it because it's so decentralized and because it's so local. It's not the same as with a central government with, I don't know, London doing it for 60 million people. It's the people actually coming together and saying, okay, let's do this together. One great example when it comes to private initiative I also have is the so-called Alpenvereine, or Alpine clubs in Germany and Austria. And I'm pretty sure they also exist in Switzerland. I'm not entirely sure, but so there's the German Alpine Club, and then there's the Austrian Alpine Club. And I'm, for instance, I'm a member. You kind of pay like, I think, 50 euros a year to be part of it. You get a lot of stuff from it, equipment, free courses and stuff like that, like hiking courses or skiing courses or something like that. But what is also the case is that if you go into the Alps, you will have hundreds of huts in the middle of the mountains, just basically out of nowhere. And I can always attest to that when I go hiking. You go into the mountains and you're really exhausted, obviously, because it's really steep or whatever, and you go up there and suddenly you have a restaurant up there, or you have a hut up there or something like that. And those are all owned privately. They're also part of the Alpine Club sort of initiative. And so you have the entire logistics, the entire food stuff, you have all of that provided in the Alps with hundreds of huts that are all private. Yes, they're also subsidized, I mean, in some sense, but not as much as you might think. And so I think, especially if I compare it to the US, where you have the national parks, which are all centrally directed through Washington, DC, and you go in there and it's all basically protected by government. I'm not saying that that's a completely horrible system, but if you compare it to that, Europe has a very private, or at least the Alps have a very private system when it comes to being outside, being outdoors, and how you, when you go outside, what that actually means. And that means that you're usually only in touch with private individuals and that just basically do stuff in the mountains by themselves.
Well, for the US, you have also a great example of satire about how the parks and the park department work. You have this TV series called Parks and Recreation, in which one of the central characters is actually a hardline libertarian, and he just works there to make the thing not work. And on the other side, you see that this same character is very much an environmentalist. He does his stuff in the forest, and he knows a lot about the wood and about wild berries and everything. So I think that the US itself is very self-aware of the problems about its own environmental regulation. Well, you talked a little bit about the European Union environmental system. Do you think that the system of the carbon tax is really working or not at all? Because you talked about the coronavirus fund, but like saying it's not working, that it will not work, but on a broader sense, do you think that the carbon tax in the European Union and everywhere else will work or not?
That is a great question. As we put together the book, I mean, my co-editor, Chris Barnard, he's pro carbon tax. I know a lot of free marketeers that are pro-carbon tax. I'm anti-carbon tax. And so we decided that we disagree, and basically had a debate in the book about carbon tax from a pro-market perspective. So I think there's at first I would say there are a lot of good arguments for a carbon tax, even from a pro-market perspective, because you obviously, when it comes to environmental pollution, you do have a negative externality. You have one property that is polluting, that is putting out the emissions, and that hurts everyone else. And there's really no way, at least not yet, to actually, define the property rights properly, and to actually, through that, internalize this externality, this pollution that is going outside and is hurting other people, or is hurting people's property. But at the same time, I think there's so many issues with it. One is political feasibility. Again, I feel like if politicians have the option to introduce a carbon tax, they will use it as a new revenue source, and they will use it well, as they do with any other tax. It will be, I don't think we can really agree on a prudent method of how to introduce it. There's also a lot of discussion on how high a carbon tax should even be. I mean, a few years ago, I went into all of these climate models, and there's this huge discussion on social cost of carbon, which basically means how high the carbon tax should be. And there were answers from $15 per ton of CO2, 15, all the way to 200. And there's really no good way to come up with one great number, because it's so dependent upon so many different issues. And I personally feel like if we want to protect the environment, and if we are pro-free market, we shouldn't argue for more taxes, but we should argue for less taxes. And you can do that. You can be you can have a more pro-growth tax policy that is also green. So one idea that we present in the book are clean tax cuts, which basically means that you cut taxes on environmental investments, on environmental businesses and stuff like that. So if you're in the business of improving the health of the world, then you pay less or no taxes at all. And I think this breaking down barriers, reducing the tax burden, all these kinds of options are much better ways to protect the environment, to help the environment from a pro-market perspective, than it would be to increase barriers, to increase taxes, which I think might be counterproductive.
Well, green taxes are also a burden to production, because it makes the production cost greater, and so it disincentivizes most enterprises and most individuals and entrepreneurs to actually produce, because it will be more expensive for them to produce because they have to pay another tax. And that's only on a very particular level.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a bit of that. What do you actually want to achieve? If you do carbon taxes, you are what you're basically doing is that you're penalizing bad behavior. Whereas I think it would be much wiser to incentivize good behavior. And that's where you would say, okay, let's cut taxes on good behavior instead of penalizing bad behavior, because that doesn't really help anyone. I mean, if you're penalizing bad behavior, say you're putting up a huge carbon tax, you're penalizing bad behavior and you're driving out businesses that are carbon intensive. But okay, so those businesses are gone. You don't have any new businesses. You don't have businesses that do good. You actually want to have good businesses. So you first have to give people the incentive and give people the option to do good. And then, I mean, the market competition will probably drive out the bad businesses anyway. So instead of penalizing bad behavior, how about incentivizing good behavior? I think that's much better.
Well, on an international level, on the other side, you have this carbon quota thing that most of the governments that that have signed both the Paris and the Tokyo agreements are actually imposed on themselves. And by using these carbon quotas, they are reducing their carbon production in a sense, but they are letting some of the countries that are actually very, very contaminating, such as China or Russia or India, do as they please, while the rest of the Western world is reducing their production and their development only to agree on something that they don't even know, that they don't even understand too well. What do you think is the solution for the carbon quota problem, so to speak?
I think there's not really a great solution, globally speaking, when it comes to actually getting countries like China or Russia into these kinds of agreements. I honestly don't really see an option for that. And I mean, these kinds of agreements have had some really bad results in the past. I remember, I think one of those agreements actually would have led to more, that Russia actually profited from producing more coal, which is completely counterproductive. And I think, in a sense, these kind of global agreements can always only be voluntary agreements that we can take as a kind of benchmark, and then national governments or businesses need to look for, well, making it happen. And so if you look, for instance, at the Paris Agreement, what I think is very, very positive from a pro-market perspective is that over 240 of the biggest corporations in the world have voluntarily signed up to making the Paris Agreement happen in their business. They weren't forced by governments to do so. They said, okay, we want to do this. And I think that's a great example of private initiative, because these companies don't have to do that. And if they're actually the evil neoliberal corporations that the leftists are making them out to be, then they would have no reason to do it. But they voluntarily said, we want to do this because we care about the planet. And so we will do, and obviously because they also have an incentive in our cultures where the environment is so important. Obviously, business also need to look environmentally friendly, or else they won't sell anything. And so I think, but both that, you know, that, okay, let's, but it doesn't really matter what the reasons are. There's a lot of private initiative. And one might say that the Paris Agreement, in that sense, gave a good benchmark that now corporations are actually following. How to get China into that is a great question that I don't really know. As with a lot of different things in this world today, it's difficult to answer how to actually handle China.
Well, you have, first of all, the voluntary initiatives. The most of the greatest enterprises are taking or appear more eco-friendly. But on the other side, you also have the development of green technologies by private individuals. I think no government in the world is actually promoting green technologies to be created, to be produced, but most of the private sector is. You can see a lot of these examples in green plastics and fresh air filters and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are governments that are promoting green energy quite a bit, but that's usually not that great. So if you look at my own country, Germany, we've been having this thing called Energiewende, which means energy transition. We've been having that for like, I would think about 10 years. And the goal was basically to have a transition to renewable energies and to have a more clean energy system in Germany. Now, the first mistake was that they basically said, let's do this by shutting down all of the nuclear plants, which doesn't make any sense, because nuclear energy could provide a great alternative to fossil fuels to have a cleaner world. But what they then did is to subsidize the heck out of renewable energies, which drove up electricity prices immensely. Germany now has the highest electricity prices in the world, which doesn't really suit people very well, especially poor people, because they now have a much bigger energy bill. And at the same time, it hasn't really, since they also switched off the nuclear plants, it hasn't really helped the environment a lot, because at the same time, coal production has gone up in Germany. So you have both renewable energies and coal winning and nuclear energy losing. But it doesn't really help the environment in that sense. And so you've also had sort of this weird, you had these weird incentives. For instance, obviously, if you have solar energy, you don't have sun all the time, not in Germany for sure. Wind energy, you don't have wind all the time. So there were times in Germany where you had too much energy, actually, and we had to basically get rid of it to other countries, and so that they can use it. Okay, you just take it, sort of. And then there were other times where you didn't have sun and you didn't have wind, and we suddenly didn't have enough energy, and then we had to use coal, or we had to buy energy from other countries who might have used nuclear energy for that. So the energy policy of Germany is completely mind-boggling, and is a great example of how government directing the energy markets is terrible. Whereas if you look at a country like, not a country, but the state of Texas in the US, it has had one of the most deregulative, pro-freedom energy markets in the world, and they are now one of the greatest renewable energy producers in the world. And it worked. And so, yeah, I would always look at private companies solving these problems, not the government, because as you can see in the case of Germany, if you have government solving it, if you have government solving it, you probably will have incentives the wrong way. You will have perverse incentives, and that will inevitably hurt both the market as well as the environment.
Well, the case for both the European countries as well as the US, it's a much greater economic freedom in order to create and to promote green energies and green technologies. Here in Latin America, you have a different problem in which, as energy and the environment are both public goods and public objectives, the government has a lot of implementation plans of green technologies and green energies. In my country, in Ecuador, we had a huge amount of hydroelectrical projects in order to create energy with the currents of the different rivers. These projects were constructed by Chinese companies, and they were a huge deal of corruption for most of the government officials. So in a sense, you see when the market it works with the environment, it works perfectly fine. But when the government come in, they do whatever they want, and they manage to make it a way of living for most of its officials.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. Government, when it comes to the environment, governments can define property rights, and especially level the playing field, giving everyone the same chance on the market. But what governments tend to do in the environmental realm is they regulate, they subsidize. So they do the exact opposite. Instead of leveling the playing field, they are actually picking winners and losers depending on who has the greatest force, the greatest power in policymaking, who has the special interests, who has the lobbying power. All of these kinds of things are part of that process. And by that, you're distorting the market, and in a way that it won't help the environment either.
Right. I think there are a few questions One says, shouldn't we consider environmentalism as a step towards the single global state? Well, he's talking about globalism and how environmentalism is a part of its plan.
Not at all. As I explained, I think like that's precisely the thing, that we are seeing it that way. I think that's a problem, because we can have a different type of environmentalism. We don't have to have only the environmentalism that we know from the left. We can have a different environmentalism. And if you look at globalism versus, let's say, localism, just look at Roger Scruton, for instance, this conservative hero, one of the greatest conservatives in the 20th century. He was a big environmentalist. He wrote books on it. He wrote essays on it. He had his own Scrutopia, his own utopia after Roger Scruton. And you can have, that's precisely the thing. And that's why we actually worked on the book, was that we have a different version of the environmentalism that is not the way that the left is portraying it, and that we're not letting them monopolize the issue, that we're not leaving them the entire space to argue about that, but that we say, no, we can do it differently. We can protect the environment through private property, market economy, local communities, and innovation. And that's much better than whatever they come up with.
Yeah, you see that the left version of environmentalism is very revolutionary, in a sense that it tries to regress the human population to their state of nature. On the other hand, you have the rightist version of environmentalism that tries to preserve and conserve the nature because it is an aesthetic thing to do.
I agree with that. But that's the important thing. There are different types of environmentalism, and it's not good to say, okay, the environment is something that the leftists do, so that's not something we should care about because it's a leftist topic. No, environmentalism is as much a topic for everyone else as it is for the left, and we need to own the issue. We need to really jump on it, and we need to make our case for it, because this topic is way too important to simply ignore. Politically speaking, because it's such an important topic that I don't think any political party in 10 or 20 years could win an election without a good environmentalist platform, because it's such an important topic for people. But also, I mean, simply, isn't our planet worth preserving? I feel like that's just such a straightforward argument to say, okay, simply because of that, because we want to protect our nature, we should care about this issue, and we should come up with our solutions instead of just leaving it to the left to basically mess it up.
Well, I think that as a final comment, both from you and me, we can see that most of the landowners, the rural landowners, both in Europe as in the US, as in Latin America, they are some of the most environmental people in all of the world, because they are not only caring about the nature and the environment, but they are living and producing from it. While on the other hand, you have most of these urban militants who are using the environment as an excuse to promote greater and heavier taxes.
Yeah, and I can only agree with that. I think it's just so important that we take on this issue and to prove that, yeah, the market as well as local options are much better avenues of environmental protection, as more taxes, more regulation, more subsidies, more government. That's not the solution for the environment. We need something different, and that's where we need to rush in.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this topic because, well, most of us, we really think, well, I thought that the environment was a left-wing topic, but I know right now, I know for sure I was wrong, because the environment actually is a universal topic that both libertarians, classical liberals, conservatives should care too much about it. We have led the left, the progressive left, and the socialist left to hijack this topic and to make it one of its flags. We shouldn't have led that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Kai, for your comments and for your talk today. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.